On behalf of the Baptist Studies Center and the Siburt Institute for Church Ministry, we are thrilled to bring you today's discussion on pastors and politics, exploring the intersection of ministry and political life. So, since America's inception, these two have never been very far apart, from the founding of the Plymouth Colony to the American Revolution to the Civil Rights Movement. And so what continues to be a challenge is how ministers can engage it well, keeping in mind not only the need for Christians to speak clearly and prophetically in public, but what practical challenges there are to this intersection. So today we have three wonderful guests to help us think through this. First up, we have Jemar Tisby. Jemar was this year's speaker at the inaugural Don Williams and Royce Money Distinguished Lecture Series, and is the newly inaugurated Assistant Director of Narrative and Advocacy at the Center for Anti-Racist Research at Boston University, under the direction of award-winning historian and #1 New York Times bestselling author, Ibram X. Kendi. He is the author of the New York Times bestseller, The Color of Compromise. He's president and co-founder of The Witness, a Black Christian collective, and co-host of the podcast, Pass the Mic. His new book, How to Fight Racism, was recently released in January. Tisby has his MDiv from Reformed Theological Seminary and is presently working toward his PhD in history at the University of Mississippi, studying race, religion, and social movements in the 20th century. Jemar and his family call the Deep South, or have until recently called the Deep South home, and especially love the weather, people, and the food. We also have back with us a good friend of the center, Jennifer Hawks. Jennifer is Associate General Counsel at the Baptist Joint Committee. She provides legal analysis on church-state issues that come before Congress, the courts, and administrative agencies. Jennifer also assists in educational efforts and responds to pastors and other constituents who have questions about church-state issues. She received her JD from the University of Mississippi School of Law, her MDiv from George W. Truett Theological Seminary at Baylor University. And she's a member of the U.S. Supreme Court, Texas and Mississippi bars, and was ordained into the gospel ministry by McLean Baptist Church in Virginia. We also have with us new friend, Preston Clegg. Preston is the pastor of Second Baptist Church in Little Rock, Arkansas. Before coming to Second Baptist, he pastored churches in Arkansas, Texas, and Oklahoma. Preston earned his MDiv and Doctor of Ministry from George W. Truett Theological Seminary at Baylor University, and he and his wife, Rebecca, are Arkansas natives, and they have two sons, Paxton and Truett, who keep their parents quite busy. So, just a quick word about how we'll proceed. We will begin with our panelists. I'll be asking them to offer some reflections on this intersection of pastoring and politics, or ministry and politics, and then we'll just go from there. So, Jemar, I want to start with you. Can you tell us a bit about your own history with this intersection of ministry and politics, and what you've learned about navigating that intersection?
My history, I think the most relevant portion is simply that my desire and the urgency that I felt to address politics actually kept me out of the ministry for a number of years, at least out of formal ordained ministry. I certainly look at the work that I and others are doing around anti-racism, which of course involves politics and policy as a type of ministry, but I wanted to be an ordained minister. In this case, it was in the Presbyterian Church in America, the PCA. From high school, I had wanted to go to seminary and be an ordained pastor. And it wasn't until essentially the second movement of my professional career that I finally went to seminary, as you mentioned, at Reformed Theological Seminary in Jackson, Mississippi. Now, there was the education I got in the classroom, and then there was the education I got outside of the classroom, which was deep and intense. The worst racism I've ever experienced, unfortunately, has come at the hands of other Christians. And from about 2011 to 2015, I thought I'd seen the worst of it, because I was talking about so-called controversial issues like diversity and integration and racism and all of those things. But it got immensely worse around 2015 with the presidential election cycle, the Republican nomination for the presidency. in the middle of 2015, and when we started to see who the candidate was that was emerging out of this field of nearly 24 people. And folks like me started to speak out about that individual in particular, but also the broader platform and policies. That's when I experienced sort of an acute kind of pushback that I had never experienced up to that point. So one church member called the elders on me for posting something on Facebook that he didn't like politically. I started to get undermined by other ordained pastors in that denomination, to the point where when I was going to sit for ordination exams, they were planning a coordinated effort to essentially ask me all these gotcha questions and paint me as a heretic or a liberal or whatever label they wanted to use to dismiss me. Leading up to all that, I heard about that and experienced a ton of pressure online, and eventually withdrew from that process, and had experienced such personal betrayals, such institutional betrayals, that I really had to sit on the sidelines of ordained ministry for several years. And it's really only within the past year and a half that I've felt enough healing, enough support to begin to lead God's people from the position of a formal church leadership role. So did end up getting ordained in my local non-denominational church, have been preaching and pastoring there for the past year and a half.
Jennifer, do you want to tell us a bit about your own background? How does your own history kind of inform your understanding of how ministry and politics, how these things intersect?
Sure. So let me just start by saying it's an honor to be here with distinguished guest of Jemar and Preston. So hopefully I can bring something additional to the conversation as well. So I am one of the unique blends, but not rare, of an attorney who's also an ordained minister. And what is rare about my combination is that I do see basically politics in the public square as my ministry. So I work at Baptist Joint Committee, and that is what I see as my ministry field, and that is what my church ordained me to be working in. So this is a topic that's very near and dear to my heart. And so my personal engagement is, on a regular basis, I meet with congressional staff offices to talk about bills, either bills that have already been filed or the bills that we might want to get filed. And I train people on how to be better advocates in their communities, whether it's political advocacy specifically or just kind of a more generic form of advocacy for the community. And also teach religious leaders what those legal parameters are for leading a 501c3 organization, and how that might impact the type of engagement that you can do in the political realm. One of the things I've learned in all of these interactions is words like advocacy and lobbying are often perceived as some Herculean task that only a select number of people should get to do. And that is just absolutely false. All of us are advocates in our daily lives, whether we call it advocacy or not. And so one of the stories I always like to start a training with to prove this point involves my niece and Christmas. So about a decade ago, my now teenage niece, and she is not a fan of me telling the story anymore, was a precocious 5 or 6. And all of the family lived in Memphis, Tennessee at the time, except for me. I was in Waco and I was a seminary student. And a few weeks before Christmas, the family went out for Sunday lunch after church, and the topic of Christmas presents came up. My parents were interested in what their granddaughter wanted for Christmas. And so everyone at the table talked about, what they might want for Christmas or what they might want to give someone. And my niece spoke up and asked what Aunt Jennifer would be getting for Christmas. And all the adults at the table tried to ignore her question because they knew they would talk to me later in a separate environment. But in her 5 or 6-year-old mind, Christmas was being decided right now right here at this table, and someone was left out, someone that she cared about. And so she kept bringing it up to the point that the rest of the adults at the table, stopped and started talking about what they would give me for Christmas. And of course, my niece offered a few ideas of what she thought that I would need. But on that day, my niece at the age of 5 or 6 was literally my advocate. So she knew decisions were being made and that I was being left out. And so I'll admit legislative advocacy can be more complicated. It can be more technical. But at the end of the day, all it is speaking up for what you think is right and looking for who else needs to be at the table. And so I always remind groups that I train that advocacy really is just a conversation. It might be in writing, it might be verbal, but it's just a matter of expressing why something is important to us. And so as far as like legal rules around pastors and politics, that's another area of experience of mine. There's some technical things and happy to get into them, but I wanted to share a resource that BJC created. And so it's a handout to try to help clarify what these boundaries are. There it is. So hopefully you can all see on the share screen. So we created a resource about churches and nonprofits. We want you to be advocates, but not partisans. And so that's where the real distinction comes in. And the problem with the tax code and the rules around what 501c3 organizations can and can't do is not that there's a whole lot of restrictions on what you can't do. So the advocate acrostic is examples of all the things you can do and all the things that you probably should do in some form or fashion. It's really a very narrow set of things that you cannot do with tax deductible resources. And so that's where the partisanship would come into play. So I know there's going to be an email that goes out later, and this link will be there. It's on BJC's website. It's a one-page resource. A lot of churches post it up on their community bulletin, especially during political seasons, just as a reminder that we are supposed to be engaged in these activities. And so I think I just want to end this little intro part with just a reminder that as faith leaders, we have a platform in the community that a lot of people don't have. And so we have to treat it with respect. Some pastors take advocacy and see, a calling to be arrested for civil disobedience as part of that advocacy. Not all pastors see it in that way. And the good news is there are a whole lot of forms of advocacy. There's a lot of different ways that we can be advocates. And so sometimes advocacy is inviting a guest preacher from a different background from your congregation to preach in your service, with you sitting there listening to that guest preacher as well. Sometimes it's an op-ed or a short video on social media. Sometimes it's organizing a food drive because your local food pantry is overwhelmed with what they're having to respond to. And then sometimes it's testifying at your city council that the building permits for the mosque or the temple should be approved. The hardest time to advocate, I think, is when we're being critical of politicians that we otherwise support. But we have to do that in order to maintain our integrity. Because if I only criticize politicians I would never vote for, then I would have a very small credibility in the public square. So I've got to be willing to speak up for what's important, no matter who's in power, and always look for who else's voice needs to be at the table, but also how can I bring that voice to the table?
Jemar and Jennifer, let me follow up with a quick question. In what ways have you found, or what helpful ways have you found to help people hear when it seems like you're speaking up for something that they don't want to listen to? Whether it's about racism or whether it's about religious liberty, like what ways practically have you found to help to kind of elevate the voice that needs to be heard when it seems like there are no, when people are wanting to actively not listen?
So we do that a lot with religious liberty concerns. So I just approach it, and everyone else is going to have their own approach. I approach it with trying to be as authentic as possible. because when you're speaking to groups and if you're not authentic, that can come across and will always undercut your message. And I try to always not make it about us. So one of the arguments is we want to protect religious minorities, because if they're not protected, at the end of the day, we as Christians aren't protected either. But that's also not that's not the only reason to defend religious liberty for all. Religious liberty should be defended for all, and everyone should have the ability to engage in their religious practices, whether or not it ever comes back and it impacts me as a Christian in my community. It's not always easy, but helping people to see the other perspective can be a big step forward in that process. And so that's why, like, one of the examples was being present when that other preacher was preaching at your church, so that you were also engaged. And I learned lots of things from my advocacy, whether it's the group I'm talking to or the other presenters that I've brought in or who have brought me in. And relationships cannot be overstated, their value and their role in any type of advocacy process.
And Dr. Myles, are you talking about sort of how to get people who might be resistant to a certain message, how to get them to hear?
Right. Yeah. What practical ways have you found to help kind of elevate the voice that needs to be heard, even when it seems that there's a lot of resistance to hearing it?
So a lot of times we start with that word, that action of listening, which is important. But I would even take it a step backwards and say informed listening, right? So one of the things that I try to do is know what somebody who might oppose me on a particular issue is thinking about that issue. But that's not going to be very helpful if I'm not informed, because I'm not going to be able to know what's right or wrong, just or unjust about a particular policy or particular position if I'm not informed. So I'm a bit of a news junkie, and there's some famous quote by a pastor that said, read with the Bible in one hand, the newspaper in the other. I think that principle holds true. And I can remember one of my former pastors, it was one of the many unfortunate instances of a human being becoming a hashtag. And it was a major acquittal of the perpetrator of this killing. That verdict came out, and I asked our pastor, was he going to say anything that Sunday? It was like the next day was going to be Sunday. He hadn't even heard of it, hadn't heard of the case at all. Meanwhile, people in the Black community, people concerned about anti-racism, all of that stuff, it's literally national news. But he wasn't informed on this particular issue, which is not a knock on his character or anything, but to think that we can just, sort of passively know what we need to know, I think is naive. We actually have to put in work to understand, as Jesus says, to read the present time, to understand, what the clouds on the horizon are going to mean rain, that the south wind is going to mean it's going to be hot, and that we have to be able to look at our current times and discern the times. Then you can listen in an informed manner, know where they're coming from, know what you're thinking, know what they're thinking. The other part of listening is knowing their sources. So there was a contentious question that was asked of me in a Q&A after a talk. And the first thing I asked this person is, what is shaping this question? Where are you getting it? And he named a particular source that I knew immediately the angle this person was coming from, and that helped me answer in a more productive way. The last part I'll say is, as ministers in general, we just have to get really, really good at telling stories. So much of what we're talking about isn't simply a matter of data or facts. It's a matter of crafting a narrative. And there are certain forces that have really bad messaging that have really good stories. And they use multimedia and they appeal to emotions. And we should be students of communication in that sense, because it's not simply about having the data on our side. It's about telling a compelling story that can sway people's hearts and wills and emotions as well.
Great. That's a great word. Preston, you want to chime in here?
Sure. And thanks for having me and for this conversation. This is a conversation that I have lived for the last 5 to 10 years. And part of my story is one of a paradigmatic revolution, is what I would call it. So when I first began pastoring, I was pastoring what I would call purple churches. And I had a pastoral pragmatism about myself that if we start talking about issues that matter, I know what it will do to my congregation, but also some convictional beliefs that when the gospel becomes over-identified with a narrow political agenda, we're in trouble. The gospel loses some of its integrity when it's tied to a narrow political agenda. And so for reasons pastoral and pragmatic, but also convictional and somewhat of what I believe Baptists to be, I forsook my public role as a pastor and functioned within the church largely. I focused on souls and spent a lot of time in my study. The last few years I've had a shift because of things that I saw that I couldn't unsee. I went on a sabbatical in 2018. My church granted a sabbatical, and I studied systemic racism on my sabbatical. 8 years ago, I came to Second Baptist Church in Little Rock, which is a church with a history of a social conscience and a church that actually expects their pastor to talk about public issues. And so I'm in a unique situation where my church expects me to talk about public things. We're also a few blocks from the state capitol, a few blocks from City Hall. And so for the same reason that preachers in small country churches have to talk about farming, I just contextually could not ignore politics. And so I'm in a church that gives me freedom. My job is never hanging over my head, at least it hasn't yet, to talk about what I believe to be the intersection of gospel and politics. And yet I saw, Jemar mentioned the 2015 campaign and election. That was a breaking point for me. And I had to rebuild my thinking from the ground up. And essentially I came to this conclusion. Silence can be just as political as anything we say from the pulpit is. And the middle ground is not necessarily holy ground either. The left ground can be corrupt, the right ground can be corrupt, and the middle ground can be corrupt too. And just like I think an over-identification with the gospel and the political agenda can be corrupting, so do I think that on moral issues that impact the image of God, that impact justice and fairness and equity in our culture, if we have nothing to say in those moments, that also hampers the integrity of the gospel. And so I have been much more vocal in the last few years about public issues in Little Rock and what I see happening in our country. We've tried to be more intentional that our discipleship at Second includes the political realm. To be clear, we're not telling people who to vote for, but we are telling people how to think about how their discipleship impacts the public arena. Voting is a way of saying our prayers. Engaging the public arena is a way of loving our neighbor. And to neglect that place at the table is to mute the prophetic voice of the church. Everyone's lesser for it. Couple of things I'll say that we've done recently, and I'll be quiet. Last year, our church adopted a racial justice statement that had general convictions, but also very specific beliefs and policy asks. And we created that document in large part to make a public statement, but also to hold ourselves accountable. And we had some very specific asks of our state legislature and our city leaders in terms of racial justice. And out of that, we formed an advocacy task force, a group in our church to teach our people how to do advocacy in the multitude of ways that Jennifer mentioned a few minutes ago. So I have come to the place where I think what you say can hinder your gospel witness. Also, what you refuse to say can hinder your gospel witness. And there are some Sundays that I feel like I'm dancing on a pinhead, but I want to stand where the holy ground is, and that's not right, left, or middle. That's the highest ground.
Got a question that came in just a second ago that I want to follow up with y'all on this very question. So Preston, you've just talked a bit about kind of your own the legacy at Second Baptist and the ways in which your church historically has engaged public questions in the way that you do that from the pulpit. But this is a question that I would love to hear all of y'all reflect on. So the question comes in: can the church take a lead in healing from the destruction and betrayal that many people have experienced from the church? And here the question references elections, racism, Black Lives Matter, police reform and brutality. Like, the question was phrased, how can the church? But I'm gonna maybe twist it just a little bit to ask maybe a different kind of question. Can the church take the lead? What do y'all think?
I think we can and we must. Very little of Jesus' ministry was done in private. Jesus had a very public ministry. And I think the church has a public ministry. I think there's huge parts of the biblical canon that we have taken scissors to. The vast part of the prophetic literature, we nod to, but we can't find it in our Bibles. We don't know what to do with it when we read it. When was the last time that Amos roared from a pulpit? When was the last time we recognized the prophetic nature of Jesus? I think the church needs to spend a great deal of time lamenting our complicity in injustice in this country. We've been part of the problem, but I also think we can not just lament what we've done wrong, but we can learn to repent, to think different, to turn around, and to lead the charge in doing right. I do think that's possible, and I think we have evidence of places where that's happening. The civil rights movement is Exhibit A of that. Martin Luther King Jr., before he was anything else, was a Baptist preacher. Like, this can be done.
And I think of churches like Second Baptist, where Pastor Preston is, are churches that are, for a lot of people, part of the healing. When there is this sort of exodus from a particular kind of church that is more wedded to a political party than it is to the Prince of Peace, oftentimes there's a sense of, where do we go now? What is there for us next? And it's so encouraging, although these churches are far more rare than they should be, when you find a church, and oftentimes the thing people are looking for is a church that's committed to justice in so many different ways, as part of following Jesus, not as something separate from the Christian faith. And when they find it, there's a sense of relief, a sense that you can exhale and be yourself and not always feel within the church that as soon as you walk in the church doors, you're on your guard. You're listening for what the pastor is preaching. You're tiptoeing around issues and topics with other church members. And so, yes, I think the church can, should, must be part of that healing. But like I said, unfortunately, that's far more rare than it should be.
Yeah, and I would also agree that, yes, we should be doing this, but there's no way that we could have a leadership role if we're not willing to look at where we have fallen short, as Preston was saying earlier. If we're not willing to be open and vulnerable with that conversation, then any leadership that we might try to exert, again, is going to be inauthentic. And it's going to be us trying to assert a role and an explanation And instead of coming to the table and listening and say, hey, we haven't been here like we should have been. Teach us, let us learn, let us, seek forgiveness. That might include reparations, that might include other very tangible acts of seeking forgiveness and reconciliation. But there's definitely a role for leadership. And because a lot of voices have to be heard at this table, and we each have a unique role to play in it. But we can't come in and take over and say, well, the Christian church now thinks that this is what should happen, and we're going to dictate the terms of how that happens, because as Preston and Jemar were both saying, we have not been present for this conversation in the ways that we should have been. And so we have a lot of learning and growing to do in order to exert a leadership position.
I appreciate that. And I'll add this one aspect really quickly. I think the pandemic has forced us to remind ourselves that the church is really a people and not just a place. And so as we say, can the church be part of the healing? Can the church be part of progress? Then, can we expand our understanding of the church beyond simply the local congregation, which is not to diminish the importance of the local congregation, but to say that for many of us, especially when we feel alienated from what has been our church community, we find fellowship with other believers in different ways and different forms, whether that's a group chat, Zoom calls, informal gatherings, whatever that might be. And I think it has forced a sort of healthy reevaluation of what the church can be and what the church really means.
To kind of follow up on that, got a question here from that kind of gets at these questions, not only from the perspective of, say, what can you do if you are the lead minister, but what all this has to do with, say, lay folk in the pews. So the question comes, I'm not the senior pastor at a church, but our church is often hesitant to address political or social issues. How do I navigate my desire to do so, even if senior leadership is hesitant? How do we? What would y'all think? How do we cultivate kind of a lay-led movement, even in places where the pastoral leadership might be more hesitant to do so?
I would certainly recommend talking to your pastoral leadership and having that dialogue and why it would be important to you. Most issues don't have a single right or wrong answer, and so there's lots of room for engagement and for dialogue. But there's also small group opportunities. I don't know what kind of opportunities for creating small groups, whether it's a book club or a Bible study or a gathering that's going to get together and write letters to their local politicians. One of the churches we work with, they have a political engagement team, and they get together and decide, on Wednesday night at 7:00, we're going to get together for 30 minutes and we're going to write letters to our political leaders about issues that we think are important. And so they're not speaking on behalf of the church, but they are able to gather with other congregants who are concerned about politics. And they don't write the same letter, that they write their own about their own issue. But staff provide, contact information on, which offices that, we need to be working with. And so it's a great way to engage without it being the church leadership. It doesn't always have to be, the church leadership. And in fact, it's often very, very powerful to have the lay leaders and others who are involved in it be, a very organic type of movement.
Go ahead, Preston.
I hesitate to answer because those aren't my shoes, but I can tell you what I appreciate as the pastor of a church, to echo Jennifer, is when people are candid with me, when they come to me in respectful ways and say, I heard what you said about, or I missed what you said about, why didn't you? I respect those conversations. I also respect when people don't put all the weight of my ministry on one sermon, right? Like, it would be really easy for me as a pastor to preach from a posture of reactivity where I'm rewriting my sermon every Saturday night. I could do that every week, right? That's not how I want to build my preaching ministry. I do want to talk about things that matter. Jemar mentioned this earlier. God forbid that something that's on everyone's minds be something that I fail to mention in a sermon. But I want to preach from a different posture than a constant state of reactivity. And so when people critique my ministry in total and not just in part, I've always appreciated that. And I do think we need to start thinking about the church as a prophetic community, not just the pastor as a prophetic figure, right? Like, if the only prophetic person in a church is the pastor, that's an exercise in futility. We need courageous pulpits, but we need courageous pews too. And so I would encourage people to live out their discipleship in the public arena on their own, and when possible, to partner with the entirety of their church or a small group or a Sunday school class. But we don't lack for avenues to be engaged in the public arena in ways that our faith demands and compels us to be. So I would encourage you to be creative and think about within and without your walls how you can engage.
One
Good
question.
stuff.
Go ahead,
Taking
Jemar.
notes from all y'all. This is good.
One question that just was asked in kind of in light of a lot of what we've been talking about, and I think a lot of what gets talked about with respect to ministry and politics is the role of the prophetic. But I have a question here that says, mostly I see the church interacting in a prophetic voice within the political sphere. How do we balance this with, say, a priestly role? What are some good ways for us to create the solid relationships from which we can then speak?
That's a great question. I feel like it's a weekly question for me. And I have begun to look at those roles not as opposites, but as complementary roles, with one informing the other. I'll give you a couple of examples. I pastor Black people in my congregation. How can I be quiet about racism in prophetic ways if I also am going to pastor them? They're under my pastoral care. I visit people in the hospital. How can I be silent about healthcare and good access to healthcare? Obviously, I'm willing to have the debates on the best manner in which to do that. But that's an example of how pastoral and prophetic ministry hold hands. They're not punching each other in a boxing match. They're dancing with each other. And so I would invite any pastoral leaders, whatever you do pastorally, think about the prophetic need that made that pastoral need necessary, right? Like, think about as you feed the hungry, think about why there are hungry people and how you might speak into that. While you're caring for the homeless, while you're caring for the elderly, while you're doing whatever it is you're doing, ask yourself, how was that need created by a structure, a policy, whatever, any number of factors? And so for me, I try to dance the pastoral, priestly, prophetic dance instead of seeing them as opposites.
Jemar or Jennifer, did y'all want to follow up on that? Is there a way to bring together direct advocacy, kind of the more prophetic voice, with, say, the need to also build relationships, coalitions, wherein the prophetic can kind of gain some traction? What do y'all see there?
I mean, I'm not a local church pastor, so take this with a grain of salt, obviously. But to me, a local church pastor's prophetic role is going to grow out of the priestly pastoral role, as Preston so beautifully articulated. Someone like me who comes in, we look more at the prophetic because I'm coming in about about more certain issues, and I'm building the pastoral like as I engage in the prophetic. But I think for a local church pastor, that's probably reversed. And something Jemar said earlier about us becoming better storytellers. One of the ways you move political action is being able to tell these stories of the person you visited in the hospital, of the homeless man that your church reaches out to and has a long-term relationship with, and what are his needs, instead of us assuming what those needs are. But your church has a relationship with this man and is able to help him tell his story, and on occasion telling the story for him. And so they're definitely complementary, and should be working hand in hand with the other side.
One of the things that I think of is, I mean, just to be blunt, are we playing footsie with things like racism and other forms of injustice, right? Like, I just see typically a very typical error in my view is that we are trying to hold injustice and justice together as if they can coexist. And that gets embodied when you have people who have just backwards ideas, racist ideas, unjust ideas, right? But the reflex for a lot of folks, particularly white Christians, is to say, well, how can we maintain fellowship, relationship, not alienate, et cetera, et cetera. I'm all for that, but if they're not willing to move on, some basic issues of human dignity, I don't know that there is room for that, which is one of the sobering things. But look, it's all about context. And in 2021, what we've seen, what we've heard in the political sphere, the social sphere, in policing and immigration, in misogyny and patriarchy, like the issues we're dealing with have forced the issue. It's forced a lot of people to really publicly declare themselves and where they are on the side of justice. And there are a lot of people who aren't willing to move and aren't willing to budge. And I don't think that it is possible, let alone asking the question of whether it's right, to make room for all of that in your preaching, local congregation, ministry, et cetera. So it's just one of those hard things that I think we got to deal with. It's like, there are some people, because of what they choose to believe, who there's not going to be fellowship with light and darkness.
Jemar, recently on the podcast that you and Tyler do, you've talked about the role of leaving loud within denominational life. Do you see this as part of this process in terms of prodding congregations to be able to address issues of injustice that are not only external to the church, but those that are kind of taking root within congregational life?
Right. So, sometimes separation is necessary. There was an earlier question about, if I'm not in ordained ministry, how do I, take action? How do I be an advocate, et cetera, et cetera? Well, let's say you've gone through the process. You've spoken to the pastors, you've talked to the elders, you've gone through sort of the established channels. Well, we know there are a lot of churches under the captivity of, say, Christian nationalism, and they're not budging. Not about to change, and you've tried everything you know how to do. Well, then what? Separation might be necessary. And then what we've done with the Leave Loud campaign is to say, particularly for Black people and people of color, we often leave quietly, typically out of a respect for the church, but at the same time, does our silence allow them to perpetuate their bad behavior? And so again, contextually in 2021, after we've seen the immediate past president, after we've seen an attempted insurrection, after we've seen voter suppression and attempts to pass bills and laws that would do that, it's a time to speak up, is my view. And it's a time to say, this isn't right. This is not behavior that is in step with the gospel. And then simply telling our testimony, here's what happened to me. Here's how the church, unfortunately, has been an agent of trauma rather than healing. And it is from Mark chapter 6, where, of course, we know the part that says, shake the dust off your feet, off your sandals, right? But it goes further to say, as a testimony against them. And so to me, that public part of saying, here's my testimony, is that testimony against them, where they should feel this sort of, righteous judgment that people who are concerned about justice can't find space in that fellowship or that congregation. And that's what Leaving Loud is trying to get at.
Yeah. So this is a question that I'm seeing a lot of different people asking some similar iterations. So audience, if you've asked a version of it, I'm going to try to combine a couple of them here. I'm seeing several people, and from lay folks and ministers of different kinds, asking about the discomfort that comes with getting involved in politics, particularly in church contexts. I think particularly over the last year, a lot of churches are very there's been so many issues that have been raised, not only by the pandemic, but all the kind of the confluence of different social events that have kind of come together all in this year. And so just anecdotally, as I talk to a lot of ministers, there's just a lot of kind of uncertainty and anxiety already. So what would you say to a minister that is concerned with kind of the emotional intensity that gets added in when you begin to address politics? What would you offer to them?
It's tricky. We're not just saved by faith, we minister by faith too. And I think the minister has to be the non-anxious presence in the church, but also the most truthful voice in the church. Both of those must be held in tandem. I do think we're at a fracturing point as a culture, though, and as a church. Jemar, I've heard him multiple times use the word sifting. This is a sifting moment for the church. And I feel for all the ministers who will inevitably hear, you're dividing our church, or why are you stirring things up? It reminds me of Paul going to Thessalonica in Acts chapter 17, if I could get all preachery on you, in which they accuse Paul of, they stir up a mob, and then they accuse him of disturbing the peace. But Paul literally came preaching peace. There's a difference between keeping the peace and making peace. And what I have tried to say to the people of Second is, I pray for this church, but I also pray for the capital C church. And what a lot of people only care about is keeping the peace of their church. What I care about is the peacemaking of the capital C church. And what would it look like for there to be relationships of equity and justice between the white and black church? And if that means some white folks leave a white church, then so be it. But that is not shalom as we know it. That's a shallow and hollow version of peace. So it does take some courage, no doubt about it. There's no way around that. It takes courage. I think you lean on your pastoral social capital with the people. I've been there for you. I will be there for you. But we're following Jesus best we know how, singularly in this direction. So be prayed up, a higher vision, love people well. The problem with being a pastor is you have to live with the people you preach to. And that's a hard thing to do. But sometimes that allows you to speak truth that they will hear in a way that no other voice will permit. So what are you storing up social capital for, if not for moments like this? So that's how I've tried to do it. And yet it's not easy. And I feel for anybody who's struggling to do it.
Yeah, I mean, I would echo that you definitely have to make deposits into the life of the church in order to challenge them to do something unexpected or out of the ordinary. If you come in from day one, just preaching the most controversial political topics from a perspective that the congregation is not at all familiar with, you're not going to have a long ministry there, because you don't have that relationship built up, that they can trust you, that you are leading them in a proper direction. I think it's important for faith leaders to have get their news from a diversity of sources, to not always rely on one news source, even if you don't agree with the other news source, so that you're seeing the other side of the argument, so that you approach an issue with humility and with grace, and that you don't know everything about it. Willing to have conversations with people in your congregation who disagree with you, and not shut them out, and only talk to these people who politically agree with you. And I also think it might be helpful to have a pastor friend in town who has a different political viewpoint than you do. So if you're a strong Democrat or a strong Republican, try to find a pastor who has the opposite viewpoint, and see if y'all can have some kind of regular get-togethers or phone calls, or just have support and talk through things with someone who if we as Christians can't get together across the political spectrum, there's no hope for the rest of society. So we shouldn't be afraid of reaching out to our colleagues who view politics differently than us, but you have to be willing to have that honest engagement with them. And so I think some small steps like that can also be helpful for handling the emotional toll that will come from this.
This is sort of off topic, but I think it pertains to some things that Jennifer was saying. And as we're saying, there's a sifting happening, and people, it's just harder and harder to stay in that middle ground. And if we are honest and name it, historically in the United States, there's been a two-party system since at least the middle of the 19th century, and there's typically two different ways to pursue electoral success, and one party or another adopts one of the ways. One way to pursue electoral success is to have a big tent, cast the net as wide as possible, so that you capture a majority of votes. And lately, especially in the late 20th and now into the 21st century, that's been a multiracial, multi-ethnic kind of party, which then leads to these attention to justice issues, because those are part of your constituents, right? But then there's the other approach to electoral success, which says, honestly, white people have been in the majority most of the time. It's quickly changing right now. And the way to get elected is to double down on white voters, who typically turn out at higher rates, and older voters and things of that nature. But because of your constituency, then your scope of concerns is much narrower. I'm being very diplomatic about it. I'm trying to. My point being, it is harder and harder for anybody who's concerned about justice, particularly for people of color and historically marginalized groups, to sign on to the Republican platform as it stands, at least nationally, for sure, right? But we're also seeing this at the state legislature level. And this is not even really just partisan, right? It's not about right or left or red or blue. It's about right or wrong. And what the analogy I always use is, in a sports game, what makes a good referee is not that they call the same amount of penalties on each team, it's that they call the penalties that are made regardless of who makes them. And so if it so happens that one team is committing more fouls, that doesn't make the referee or the judgment unfair to call those fouls, right? So I'm just calling it like I see it. And there's a particular political party right now that's doing a lot of fouls when it comes to biblical justice. And so then the question is, all of that is built up to say, are there conservatives that we can actually lift up as better examples, right? not just the talking heads, not just the pundits, not just the people who are, being deliberately inflammatory, but are there reasonable people? I point to folks like David French, Karen Swallow Prior, people who I disagree with politically on a lot of stuff, but I know they're arguing in good faith, right? So as we talk about this stuff, I think, especially when we're dealing with predominantly white churches, the pull is toward Christian nationalism. The pull is toward the Republican Party is the only Christian party, right? Is there a way that we can not just sort of lop off half of the electorate, but say there are other ways to be what your party professes to be, but is not living out very well?
Good word. That's a good word. We've got time for, I think, one more question. So I'm going to follow up, Jemar, with what you just said. By the way, we're going to have Karen Swallow Prior. We're going to have a conversation with her in September. We just got that scheduled, so that'll be good. Look forward to that. I'll send out information about it. When we're thinking about kind of the role of ministers in public, so there's a lot of scriptural examples which y'all have pointed to in various kinds of capacities. One which frequently comes up here in these kinds of conversations is Romans 13. You know the passage I'm talking about, Romans 13, 1 through 5, where it talks about submitting to the government. Talk to us just kind of off the top of your head as you're thinking about kind of all the ways in which churches both kind of there are times in which we cohere to kind of what are the predominant norms, and there are times in which Christians need to definitely deviate from the dominant norms. Like, how do you think about kind of this dynamic of church's relationship to government in those spaces? What is that? How do you think about that?
Well, just off the top of my head, I usually get the Romans 13 question when the person supports the government and the politicians that are in power. But when they're not in power, we hear about the Revelations 13 church and how we should challenge and we should be out front. So oftentimes when I get the question, it actually betrays the political basis, because I don't hear a lot of conservative leaning religious leaders talking about a Romans 13 church when it's a Democratic led government, and vice versa. I don't hear our liberal pastors talking about a Romans 13 church when it's a conservative government. So, I mean, the church is supposed to be both. Like, there are times that we submit to government authority, and there are times that we challenge government authority, and that shouldn't be an either or decision that we have to make. It's a both and that happens every day, every week, every month. And it should never be a one or the other. Otherwise, we've betrayed the gospel.
Yeah, that was beautifully said. Don't have a lot to add, except I think a lot of talking heads today interpret Romans 12 through Romans 13 when I interpret Romans 13 in light of Romans 12, right? Present your bodies as living sacrifices. Do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. And so if Romans 13 is the only lens through which we can make sense of this dynamic relationship, what would we have done in Germany, a few decades ago? If that is your only lens through which to understand the relationship between church and state, you're going to be very limited contextually when a government does need to be resisted. And I agree with Jennifer. I don't think it's all one or all the other. I think we work with the powers that be as much as we can. We hold them accountable always, and we work around them and subvert them when necessary. I think that's what we see modeled in Jesus. Paul, who wrote Romans 13, wrote most of his letters from prison. And so I think this dualistic wisdom is probably the proper posture moving forward of the church and the state and how we relate together.
We're running up on that 2 o'clock hour. So I just want to say thank you so much to our panelists for today. Thank you so much for your time. Thank you so much for your wisdom. Thank you so much for sharing with us your experience and kind of everything that you have learned. We've been recording, and so everything will be available very soon, and we'll send out an email to all the participants and everyone who signed up so that you can watch this again and gain what you missed the first time. So thank you so much for everyone's time. And on behalf of the Baptist Study Center and the Siburt Institute, I want to say thank you for your afternoon and have a good rest of your afternoon.